Hello and welcome to PropNext, the property podcast about all things related to the future of real estate. I'm delighted that you've joined me today. My name is Gavin Morgan, your host. If you'd like to know a little bit more about me, please check out www.propnext.com. That's propnx.com. Or drop me a line if you'd like to chat privately on gavinrmorgan@propnext.com. That's GAVINRMORGAN @propnext.com. So Adam Dickson, thank you very much for joining us today on PropNext.
Thanks for inviting me on, Gavin.
So Adam, you're head of underwriting for Belfast Commercial Funding. I think just for the sake of the listeners, could you maybe kick off with a little bit about yourself and your current role?
Okay, yeah. I have spent about 25 years in property development, focused on the finance end of it. I've worked with Gareth Graham in Oakland Holdings for that length of time, and during that time we've undertaken all sorts of development, offices, houses, apartments, retail, and that's what I've spent up until the most recent years. That's what I've spent my time doing, Gavin. And then we started Belfast Commercial Funding last year. It grew out of a pilot, for want of a better word, that we'd run alongside the development business. We had experience, came from our experience as borrowers, as a developer, and the difficulties associated with that following the global financial crisis. And that led to some opportunities to lend, and we'll be doing that since 2016. So, and then last year we launched it as a business and fully funded it as a business.
Adam, really interesting. And you've got a market here where you've had some good, clear runway to really establish a strong presence. It seems your business has grown considerably over the last number of years, and you're almost exclusively property focused as well. That's correct, yes?
That's right, yeah. That's where our background is and where our expertise is. And so, yeah, we focus on commercial real estate, whether that's investment, repositioning, or development.
Yeah. And Adam, I suppose I became much more interested in this space during a time that I worked in New York, where the sophistication of capital stacking in real estate is really way beyond anything that I've seen in certainly any other part of the world that I've worked in. And it was probably a time when I became aware of and just understood that private lending or non-bank lending was such a big part of the market, much more than I'd realized prior to that stint that I did over in New York. And it seems to me that the future of lending probably continues to expand, or is expanded through institutions that are maybe non-traditional finance houses. Is that the way you see the industry, particularly with how the world's moving at the moment, specifically around rate rises and all the other bits and pieces that are going on? Or do you think the banks will grow again as lenders alongside a growing pool of other private institutions involved in lending?
The Irish market has been much less sophisticated than the example you used, the New York market. Up until in the run-up to the global financial crisis, Irish banks tended to provide all of the finance. So there wasn't a space for alternative lending at all. And as these things happen, the pendulum swings. The crash came, the pendulum swings, and the banks withdrew from the market altogether, and it left a vacuum, for want of a better word. The process of loan sales probably kicked off the attracting international finance into that alternative space, focused primarily on loan sales and refinancing loan sales. I think the banks have their part to play going forward. When we started this business or started lending in 2016, we probably thought it would be short term. But we don't anymore. We see the fact that the banks have permanently repositioned the regulation that they're subject to, and their appetite has permanently changed, and it creates a space for alternative lending that I think will be there going forward. The Irish market, as I say, it has been less sophisticated. The economic impact of that vacuum has been long felt, particularly in the north, more so than the south. The south attracted a bit more inward investment because there was more international money there. That vacuum is, it affects the ability of the economy to thrive, and that's why we started lending. We found it difficult as a large-ish developer to fund projects. We could see the difficulties that small developers had, and seasoned developers had started to focus on only schemes that they could finance with equity, and that leads to the shortage of housing that we now see, both north and south.
Yeah. And Adam, you talked about sophistication just when you were answering what I'd asked you previously. And right now, and again, just sort of reaching back to my experience, particularly in the US, where you often had layers of equity, multiple layers of equity, and multiple layers of different types of debt, all coming together to make assets or development projects happen. There's obviously quite a difference between that market and the market we're talking about today, and that very often the scale of capital required wouldn't justify that approach. But if you take it away from single asset and look at some of the master planning projects that could be delivered, not just in Northern Ireland, but throughout the island of Ireland, it's easy to see how there could be requirements for sophisticated and sort of multi-party equity and debt structures applied to future development projects. Do you think this country do you think financing becomes sophisticated where there are multiple partner equity and debt providers on bigger projects? And if you do you think that happens quickly, or because of the more conservative nature of the market here, do you think that happens over a long period of time?
I think it would. I think it'll happen over a long period of time. To answer the second part of your question first, and I do think there is a place for it in those. As you said, it's the scale required for that sophisticated structure, but there also are structurally important projects that need to happen that require that are of a scale that would justify that level of sophistication and structurally are of key importance to the economies. And I think that makes it desirable and required.
Yeah. Yeah, no, indeed. And are there any, you've talked a little bit about why this market is particularly suited to this. And you and I have talked outside of this conversation about just how, and I think the bank market probably is, requirements are becoming more stringent when borrowing money from traditional financial institutions. And you've certainly got a market here where, plenty of commercial actors. So it feels particularly suited. Northern Ireland feels particularly suited to further growth in this segment as well, because of the probably less dynamic group of organizations that are offering this type of financing compared to anywhere else. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. There are very few alternative lenders in Northern Ireland. We're the only one based in Northern Ireland and headquartered in Northern Ireland. And what that enables us to do is to be able to make decisions based on our knowledge of the market. That it gets lost sometimes when it goes up to a regional credit committee who don't have a Northern Ireland focused or an Ireland focused, an Irish focused experience.
Yeah. And Adam, just pivoting to sustainability now, that isn't interestingly. I was down at the University of Ulster having a chat with some friends down there this morning, and funnily enough, the topic of green lending came up during that conversation, and we got into a big chit chat there about how we think sustainability is just going to be such a driver of almost every aspect of the real estate process, including lending, as we move forward. Have you looked at any green products yet? Do you think they're viable in a market like this? And if you haven't, are they in your plans?
We don't have a product as such. We tend to look at each proposal on its merits. But we have funded some green projects. We have a house builder who builds houses to passive standard, is how he would describe it. So he builds them.
And could you tell us a little bit about passive, please, just for the sake of the listeners as well? I've actually heard this mentioned quite a lot, particularly in Ireland.
Yeah, so passive houses focus on minimizing the loss of heat, and so they focus on air tightness, insulation, and using the heat within the house, which may be body heat, it may be cooking heat, cleaning that air, and rather than it being ventilated externally, it being used to create a ambient temperature within the house. I'm no expert on passive houses. Interestingly, the developer we've been working with and we funded, he was saying how the market isn't quite as ahead as the technology. So he builds houses to passive standard, but he puts a boiler in. And he said because buyers are still, they still require a comfort blanket of what happens if it's just not warm enough. And so
there's not quite a lot. There's not enough trust in the system yet. Basically,
that's it. There's not enough trust in the system. He said, look, I put a boiler in, but so I'm building the passive standards from point of view of air tightness and all the tests, but we're not certifying the passive because we're putting a boiler in. And he said, for most, very rarely do I expect that boiler to ever be used. And once you've had a generation of people who have come through that experience, then it will provide that confidence for passive, and for alternatives to gas and oil boilers, air source, ground source. There's a confidence gap there at the moment until people have some first-hand experience of it. I think that will build confidence over time.
And Adam, does the passive system, there's no artificial heat there at all? It's all sort of self-generative from the heat sources like human beings and fridges and things like that in the asset. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Okay. That's correct. Correct. So the one-off houses that I know of, there are a number of one-off houses that I know of that are passive, but they tend to be architects who have had previous experience of it, and they are the ambassadors for it, I guess. But it needs to become much wider to meet the climate challenge. It'll have to become much wider acceptance. Obviously, even if a boiler's there and it's not required, there is just putting it there has an emissions impact, but hopefully it builds confidence.
No, indeed. And Yeah, no. As I said, I've actually heard this mentioned a lot over the last couple of months, and it does seem to be getting there. But yeah, we need it all to happen faster. Adam, returns. Maybe just coming back to sort of lending in Northern Ireland, and again in a global career. I've always looked back at Northern Ireland and thought that the return levels are particularly attractive here, and I think on a relative basis have been particularly attractive to a lot of other bigger places. There are obviously reasons for that. You typically get a higher yield in a location like Belfast compared to a place in like London. There's no shame in that. On the lending side of things, just our returns better here, our returns stronger in a slightly less competitive market, or are you seeing Northern Ireland sort of tacking at the same rates as places like London and Dublin?
There would definitely be a higher yield in Belfast, and I know you've seen it over the years, Gavin. Belfast, whether it's a Marks and Spencer's covenant, it's the same Marks and Spencer's covenant of a store in Belfast as it is in London, Glasgow, Manchester. But the yields, there's always been a variance in the yields. There is less capital deployed in Northern Ireland, therefore it's at a slightly higher yield than would be in some of the larger cities. But it would be comparable to, if you look at Ireland as a whole, it's pretty comparable. Dublin's, if you exclude Dublin, Belfast, Cork, Limerick, and the regional areas are all very similar.
Okay. Well, look, Adam, I think that brings us sort of toward a conclusion to today's conversation. But clearly, you've discovered a bit of a niche here, certainly in Northern Ireland and across the island of Ireland as well, and established an incredibly successful business, and really, in some ways, really brought private lending or non-bank lending sort of out into the open in Northern Ireland, which I think is fantastic. I thank you very much for sharing your views and thoughts with us today on PropNex, and hopefully we maybe get you back on at some time in the future.
Thanks, Gavin. Thanks for the opportunity.
So that's a wrap for today's show. I'd like to thank you very much for tuning in to listen today, and hope to welcome you back to hear some of our future shows. As I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about me, look at www.propnex.com. That's PROPNX.com. Or drop me a line on gavinrmorgan@propnex.com. That's GAVINRMORGAN@propnex.com. I hope to hear from you soon, and thank you very much again for tuning in today. All the very